They said Alaska would make you free, but most who went learned it would cost them everything they thought they knew about survival. Before the oil pipelines, before the tourist lodges, before Alaska became another state with highways and cell towers, there was the raw deal of learning to stay alive when civilization was just a memory and winter lasted 8 months. They would call it survival, but most would remember it by the silence, endless white silence broken only by the scrape of bone tools and the whisper of wind through buffalo hide. Before modern heating, before insulated homes, before anyone thought winter was something you could simply wait out indoors, there was the long work of staying alive. Tonight, we return to the frozen landscapes of pre-contact America, when ordinary families faced 6 months of cold that could kill, and turned winter from a season of death into a season of patient endurance. Morning breaks over an Iroquois longhouse, smoke rising straight up in the still air. Inside, families tend fires that haven't died in months, women scraping deer hides while children sort dried corn kernels into bark containers. Across the frozen northeast, similar scenes unfold: Lakota families banking snow around their tipis, Inuit hunters reading wine patterns in snowdrifts, Apache families rationing piñon nuts in desert canyons. In that narrow space between autumn's preparation and spring's promise, you stand with everything you need to survive stored in underground pits and rawhide containers, listening to the first sounds of winter settling in for the long stay. This is not a story of dramatic survival or heroic endurance. It's the slow work of making brain-tan leather soft enough to keep children warm, of knowing which snow is safe to melt for drinking water, of sitting motionless beside seal breathing holes for 10 hours at a time. It's about patience measured in seasons rather than minutes, and wisdom passed down through the beautifully boring repetition of tasks that kept entire communities alive. Welcome to American Sleepless Story, where forgotten moments from America's past become tonight's gentle companion. These are quiet stories told slowly, perfect for when your mind needs to wander somewhere peaceful. If you'd like more stories like this, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are. I love knowing this community spans different places and time zones, all finding rest in the same American stories. Now, settle in, here comes the story. Chapter 1. Shelter. The first line of defense: picture stepping into a world where your home wasn't just where you lived, but literally what kept you alive through months of killing cold. Native American tribes across North America understood something we've forgotten in our centrally heated, insulated world. Shelter wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Pure and simple. The Iroquois in the Northeast didn't just throw together some logs and call it a day. They spent weeks crafting long houses, those massive wooden structures that could house entire extended families. These weren't the rustic cabins you see in movies. They were engineering marvels, built from elm bark stripped in perfect sheets, layered like shingles to shed rain and snow. The process was methodical, almost boring in its precision. Bend the sapling frame, so. Lash it with plant fibers that had been soaked and twisted until they were stronger than rope. Then cover it all with bark so carefully fitted that not a single drop of moisture could seep through. Inside these long houses, families lived in a world of constant, gentle warmth. Central fire pits burned day and night, their smoke rising through adjustable holes in the roof, a simple but brilliant ventilation system that kept the air breathable while preserving heat. Women wove mats from cattails and corn husks, creating thick insulation for the walls that trapped warm air like a cozy blanket. The smell was distinctive: wood smoke mixed with the earthy scent of dried corn and the subtle sweetness of maple syrup that had been stored for winter. Children played in spaces that could stretch 60 feet long, their laughter echoing off bark walls, while adults went about the quiet business of survival. It was a sleepy, rhythmic life where the biggest excitement might be adjusting the smoke hole cover when a storm rolled in. But that very predictability was what kept everyone alive. Out on the Great Plains, the Lakota had perfected an entirely different approach to winter shelter. The tipi wasn't just portable, it was a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering disguised as a simple tent. Buffalo hides, scraped and tanned until they were supple as leather, but tough as canvas, were sewn together with sinew. Though fine, it was almost invisible. The conical shape wasn't an accident. It was the result of generations of trial and error that had proven this design could deflect prairie winds that would flatten any other structure. Setting up a tipi was like watching a slow, meditative dance. First came the careful arrangement of poles, each one positioned at precisely the right angle, then the methodical wrapping of hides, every fold and tuck designed to create an airtight seal against the elements. The beauty of tipi life lay in its intimate simplicity. A small fire at the center provided all the heat needed, its flames casting dancing shadows on the hide walls while family members sat in a circle, sharing stories or working on the endless small tasks that winter demanded. The air inside was warm and slightly smoky, filled with the comforting sounds of quiet conversation and the gentle crackling of burning buffalo chips when wood was scarce. Snow would be banked around the base of the tipi, creating an extra layer of insulation that turned the simple structure into a surprisingly cozy refuge. There was something almost hypnotic about the routine banking the fire at night, adjusting the smoke flap in the morning, checking the ties that held everything together against the constant prairie wind. In the Arctic, the Inuit had taken shelter construction to an art form that still amazes engineers today. Building an igloo wasn't just cutting some blocks of snow and stacking them up. It required reading the snow like a book, testing its density, checking its crystal structure, finding the perfect snow that was hard enough to hold weight, but soft enough to cut cleanly. The spiral construction method was pure genius. Each block leaned slightly inward, creating a dome that distributed weight so evenly it could support a grown man standing on top. The process was methodical and strangely soothing. Cut, lift, place, trim, cut, lift, place, trim, in an endless rhythm that gradually transformed a flat expanse of snow into a warm, protective home. Inside an igloo, the world became small and intimate. A single seal oil lamp, burning with a steady, golden flame, could raise the temperature by 40 degrees or more. The walls would glaze over with a thin layer of ice from body heat and breath, creating a hard, reflective surface that bounced warmth back into the living space. Families would spread caribou hides on sleeping platforms carved from snow, creating beds that were surprisingly comfortable. The silence was profound, muffled by thick snow walls, broken only by the gentle hiss of the oil lamp and the soft murmur of conversation. It was a world reduced to its absolute essentials, where every element served a purpose and nothing was wasted. The Southwest presented different challenges, and the Navajo responded with the Hogan, a structure that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Built from logs and stones, then covered with packed earth, the Hogan was designed to work with the desert's extreme temperature swings. The thick earthen walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the cold desert nights, creating a natural heating system that required no fuel. The entrance always faced east, toward the rising sun, partly for spiritual reasons, but also because those first morning rays would help warm the interior after a cold night. The construction process was unhurried, almost meditative, with each layer of earth packed and smoothed by hand until the walls were as hard as adobe. Life in a Hogan followed the desert's quiet rhythms. Days were spent outside when possible, taking advantage of the warming sun, while evenings brought families together around small fires of juniper or pinyon wood. The air inside was dry and clean, scented with the smoke of burning wood and the faint earthiness of the walls themselves. During winter storms, families would settle in for days at a time, working on crafts, telling stories, or simply sitting in comfortable silence while the wind howled outside. The thick walls made the Hogan incredibly quiet, a peaceful refuge where time seemed to slow down and the outside world felt very far away. Pacific Northwest tribes like the Tlingit built their long houses from cedar, that remarkable wood that seemed designed specifically for their wet, mild winters. Cedar planks were split from massive trees using wedges and mauls, creating boards that were naturally resistant to rot and insects. These long houses were enormous, sometimes housing 50 people or more, but they felt cozy rather than cavernous. The rich, warm scent of cedar permeated everything, mixing with the smell of smoked salmon and the dampness of the coastal climate. Fires burned constantly, not just for warmth, but to keep the humid air from creating mold problems. The longhouse was like a small village under one roof, with each family having its own space, but sharing in the communal warmth and security. These shelters weren't just buildings, they were the foundation of winter survival, carefully designed systems that turned the harshest conditions into manageable challenges. Each type represented generations of accumulated knowledge, passed down through families who understood that getting shelter wrong meant death, while getting it right meant not just survival, but comfort. As winter deepened and the real challenges of food preservation and warmth management began, these carefully constructed homes would prove their worth day after day, providing the secure base from which families could face the long, cold months ahead. Chapter 2: Food Preservation and Storage. When autumn arrived, Native American communities transformed into bustling centers of preservation activity, where every family member had a role in turning the season's abundance into winter's lifeline. The process wasn't glamorous, it was methodical, repetitive work that required precise timing and endless patience. In the Northeast, Iroquois women would rise before dawn during harvest season, their hands already stained from days of processing corn, beans, and squash. The smell of wood smoke hung heavy in the air as fires burned constantly under drying racks, creating that distinctive aroma that meant survival was being carefully prepared, one strip of meat and one ear of corn at a time. The Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash weren't just crops. They were the foundation of an intricate food storage system that had been perfected over centuries of trial and error. Corn preparation was an art form disguised as tedious labor. Each ear had to be husked at exactly the right moment, when the kernels were mature but not yet hard. Some ears would be braided by their husks and hung in long chains from longhouse rafters, creating a natural pantry that swayed gently in the warm air rising from the fires below. Other corn would be carefully removed from the cob, kernel by kernel, then spread on woven mats to dry in the sun. The sound was hypnotic, the soft scraping of wooden tools against cob, the gentle rustle of dried kernels being stirred, the quiet conversations of women working side by side. Ground corn became meal that could be stored in bark containers sealed with pine pitch, creating airtight storage that would keep the precious food fresh through the longest winter. Underground storage pits represented the height of Iroquois preservation technology. These weren't simple holes in the ground, they were carefully engineered food caches, dug deep enough to stay below the frost line, lined with specially prepared bark to keep out moisture and pests. The construction process was almost ceremonial in its precision. First, the pit would be excavated to exact specifications, then lined with sheets of elm bark that had been peeled in spring when the sap was running. Layer after layer of bark created a waterproof barrier, while the top would be sealed with more bark and covered with earth. These hidden pantries could hold enough food to feed a family for months, their locations known only to the women who built them, creating a network of secret abundance scattered through the forest. Out on the Great Plains, buffalo processing took on an almost industrial scale during the brief hunting season. When a herd was successfully brought down, the entire camp would mobilize in a frenzy of preservation activity that could last for days. Women worked with knives so sharp they could slice meat into paper-thin strips, each piece carefully trimmed of fat and spread on wooden racks to dry in the constant prairie wind. The sight was remarkable, acres of drying racks stretching across the camp, each one loaded with dark red strips of meat that would slowly transform from fresh buffalo to jerky hard enough to last for years. The smell was rich and smoky, mixing the iron scent of fresh meat with the sweet aroma of burning buffalo chips that fueled the drying fires. Pemmican production was perhaps the most sophisticated food preservation technique developed by any culture. This wasn't just dried meat, it was a carefully balanced superfood that combined protein, fat, and vitamins in precise proportions. Women would pound dried buffalo meat into a fine powder using stone hammers and rawhide mortar, working with a rhythm that could be heard across the camp. The powdered meat would then be mixed with rendered buffalo fat and dried berries, choke cherries, service berries, or wild plums, creating a dense, nutritious paste that was packed into rawhide containers called parfleches. A single parfleche of pemmican could sustain a person for weeks, making it the perfect food for long winter months when hunting was impossible. The parfleche itself was a marvel of plains engineering, a rawhide envelope that was completely waterproof when properly sealed. Made from buffalo hide that had been scraped until it was thin and pliable, then painted with geometric designs that weren't just decorative but served as identification markers for different families. Packing a parfleche was like creating a time capsule of summer abundance. Layers of pemmican would be separated by thin sheets of hide, pressed down firmly to eliminate air pockets that could lead to spoilage. When sealed and stored properly, these containers created an almost hermetic environment that could preserve food for years without refrigeration. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon preservation reached levels of complexity that would impress modern food scientists. The timing had to be perfect to catch the fish during the peak runs when they were fattest and most nutritious, then process them immediately before the oils could turn rancid. Tlingit and Salish women worked in teams, filleting thousands of fish with curved knives designed specifically for the task. The filleting process was almost hypnotic to watch, a smooth, practiced motion that could reduce whole salmon to perfect strips in seconds. Each fillet would be carefully examined, trimmed of any damaged flesh, then hung on cedar racks in precisely spaced rows that allowed air to circulate freely around each piece. The smoking process was where art met science. Different woods created different flavors and preservation qualities: cedar for its natural preservatives, alder for its mild smoke, hemlock for its intense flavor. The fires had to be maintained at exactly the right temperature, hot enough to drive out moisture, but not so hot as to cook the fish. Women would tend these fires day and night, adjusting them constantly to maintain the perfect balance. The finished product was remarkable salmon that was hard as leather but packed with nutrients, capable of lasting through the wettest northwest winters without spoiling. The longhouses during smoking season were filled with the rich, oily aroma of curing fish, a smell that meant security and abundance through the coming months. Storage in the wet northwest climate required special techniques. Cedar boxes, carved from single pieces of wood and fitted with tight-fitting lids, created moisture-proof containers that could protect dried fish and berries from the constant dampness. These boxes were often buried in shell middens or cached in dry caves, creating hidden food stores that families could access throughout the winter. The process of sealing a storage box was almost ritualistic: layers of dried fish separated by cedar bark, then packed so tightly that no air could penetrate. A properly sealed cedar box could preserve its contents for years, turning the abundant salmon runs into long-term food security. As the preservation season wound down and winter's approach became undeniable, families would inventory their stores with the careful attention of accountants. Every parfleche of pemmican, every basket of dried corn, every cedar box of smoked salmon represented days of survival safely banked against the coming cold. The knowledge of exactly how much food had been preserved, where it was stored, and how long it would last was passed down through generations of women who understood that miscalculating these supplies could mean the difference between a comfortable winter and a hungry spring. These carefully accumulated stores would soon become the foundation for the complex rationing systems that would see families through the darkest months, when the land offered nothing and survival depended entirely on the foresight and skill demonstrated during these busy autumn days. Chapter 3: Clothing and Protection from Cold. The difference between life and death in a Native American winter often came down to what you wore, and clothing wasn't fashion, it was survival technology refined over countless generations of trial and error. In the Northeast, where temperatures could plummet below zero and snow could fall for days without stopping, the Iroquois and Algonquin tribes had perfected the art of turning animal hides into wearable warmth. The process began in autumn with the careful selection of deer that had been feeding well through the summer, their hides thick with the fat that would make them supple and water-resistant. Women would scrape these hides for hours, using bone tools to remove every trace of flesh and fat, their hands growing sore from the repetitive motion that slowly transformed raw skin into soft, workable leather. The tanning process was both an art and a science, requiring precise timing and an almost boring attention to detail. Brain tanning using the animal's own brain matter mixed with bone marrow created leather so soft it felt like velvet, yet tough enough to withstand months of hard wear. Women would work the brain mixture into the hide with their hands, kneading and massaging until every fiber was saturated with the oils that would keep the leather flexible even in the coldest weather. The smell was distinctive, earthy and slightly sweet, mixing with the wood smoke that always seemed to hang in the air around native camps. Hours would pass in this methodical work, women sitting in circles, talking quietly while their hands performed the endless motions that turned dead animals into life-saving clothing. Sewing these garments required skills that would make modern tailors envious. Using needles carved from bone and thread made from sinew so fine it was almost invisible, women would create clothing that fit like a second skin. Moccasins were perhaps the most critical item. Poorly made footwork could lead to frostbite and death, so every stitch had to be perfect. The soles would be cut from the thickest part of the hide, while the uppers would be sewn with tiny, precise stitches that created a completely waterproof seam. Inside, they would be lined with rabbit fur or stuffed with cattail down, creating insulation that could keep feet warm even when walking through snow. The process was meditative in its repetition. Punch the hole, pull the sinew through, tighten the stitch, move to the next spot, over and over until a shapeless piece of hide became a perfectly fitted piece of survival equipment. Layering was the secret to staying warm, and Northeast tribes had developed sophisticated clothing systems long before modern outdoor gear companies discovered the concept. A typical winter outfit would start with a soft inner layer of deer skin worn against the skin, then a warmer middle layer lined with fur, and finally an outer layer designed to shed water and block wind. Mittens were connected by sinew cords that ran through the sleeves, preventing the potentially fatal mistake of losing a glove in deep snow. Hoods were lined with beaver fur that would frost over from breath but never lose its insulating properties. The whole ensemble might weigh 20 pounds or more, but it was distributed so perfectly across the body that movement remained natural and unrestricted. Out on the Great Plains, where winter winds could drive snow horizontally across vast open spaces, plains tribes like the Lakota had developed clothing systems centered around the magnificent buffalo. A buffalo robe wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a portable shelter, a blanket, and a coat all rolled into one. The largest robes, taken from prime bulls, could measure 8 feet by 6 feet and weigh 40 pounds, but they provided warmth that nothing else could match. The preparation of these robes was a community effort, with entire families working together to scrape and soften the massive hides. The fur was left on, creating a natural insulation system that trapped air in millions of tiny pockets between the individual hairs. The process of creating plains winter clothing was almost industrial in its scale and precision. Women would work in groups, each specializing in different aspects of the production. Some would focus on preparing the hides, spending days scraping and softening until the leather was perfect. Others would specialize in cutting patterns, using techniques passed down through generations to ensure that every piece fit correctly and used the hide efficiently. Still others would do the sewing, creating garments with decorative elements that weren't just beautiful but served practical purposes, geometric patterns that helped identify tribal affiliation, and beadwork that reinforced stress points where the clothing might tear. Moccasins on the plains had to be built for different conditions than those in the forest. The soles were often double or triple thickness, designed to handle the rocky ground and sharp grasses of the prairie. The uppers extended higher up the leg, creating a boot-like protection against snow and thorns. Inside, they would be stuffed with buffalo hair or sagebrush, materials that provided insulation while also helping to absorb moisture from feet that might be walking all day in snow. The decoration on plains moccasins often told stories, geometric patterns that represented family, history, or beadwork that marked important achievements. But beneath the beauty was always the practical consideration of creating footwear that could keep a person alive in conditions that could kill. In the Arctic, where temperatures could drop to 60 below zero and the sun might not appear for months, the Inuit had developed the most sophisticated cold weather clothing system ever created. Caribou hide was the foundation of their survival. But not just any caribou hide. The animals had to be hunted at specific times of year when their fur was at its thickest and most insulating. The hollow hairs of caribou fur created an insulation system that was so effective it wouldn't be matched by synthetic materials until the late 20th century. Women would spend the short summer months preparing winter clothing, working with an urgency that came from knowing that a single mistake could be fatal when the cold returned. The Inuit parka was a masterpiece of engineering disguised as simple clothing. Two layers of caribou hide, one with the fur facing in toward the skin, another with the fur facing out, created a thermal barrier that could maintain body heat even in the most extreme conditions. The hood was designed with a tunnel-like opening that could be adjusted to protect the face while still allowing vision and breathing. Mittens were often attached to the parka with long cords, and some parkas had built-in hand warmers, small pouches where heated stones could be carried. The construction required thousands of tiny stitches, each one placed with precision that left no gaps where cold air could penetrate. Children's clothing received special attention across all tribes, since young bodies were more vulnerable to cold and couldn't generate heat as efficiently as adults. Cradle boards weren't just for carrying babies, they were mobile heating systems lined with the softest furs and designed to protect infants from wind and cold. As children grew, their clothing would be carefully sized to allow for growth while still providing adequate protection. Teaching children to care for their clothing was a crucial part of their education: how to dry wet moccasins without cracking the leather, how to repair small tears before they became major problems, how to recognize when clothing was failing and needed replacement. This knowledge was literally a matter of life and death, and it was passed down with the same seriousness that modern parents might teach fire safety. The maintenance and repair of winter clothing was an ongoing process that occupied much of the long winter months inside shelters. Women would spend hours each day checking every garment for signs of wear, replacing worn sinew with fresh thread, patching small holes before they could grow larger, and treating leather with oils to keep it supple. This wasn't considered tedious work, it was seen as essential preparation for the next day's survival. The quiet, repetitive nature of these tasks created a meditative atmosphere in winter shelters, where families would work together while sharing stories or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of people engaged in necessary work. As the clothing took shape under patient hands, it became more than just protection against the cold. It became a tangible connection to the skills and knowledge that had kept their people alive for countless generations, and would soon be put to the test in the daily challenge of moving safely through a frozen world where the right clothing meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Chapter 4: Tools and Technologies for Winter Survival. The difference between surviving winter and thriving through it often came down to the tools in your hands. And Native American tribes had spent generations perfecting implements that could mean life or death when the snow began to fall. In the forests of the Northeast, where snow could pile waist deep and stay frozen for months, the Algonquin and Ojibwe had developed snowshoes that were nothing short of engineering marvels disguised as simple wooden frames. The process of making snowshoes was tedious in the most beautiful way, selecting ash or birch saplings at exactly the right time of year when the wood was flexible but strong, then steaming them over fires until they could be bent into perfect ovals without cracking. The sound of this work was hypnotic, the gentle hiss of steam, the soft creaking of wood being shaped, and the quiet conversations of craftsmen who knew that a poorly made snowshoe could leave someone stranded and frozen in deep snow. The webbing of snowshoes required skills that bordered on the artistic, using strips of rawhide cut from moose or deer hides and woven in patterns that had been perfected over countless winters. Women would sit for hours, their fingers working in steady rhythms as they created the intricate geometric patterns that weren't just beautiful but functionally perfect. Each strand had to be exactly the right tension to loose, and the snowshoe would sag under weight, too tight and it would snap in cold weather. The weaving process was almost meditative, with the soft whisper of rawhide sliding through itself, creating a gentle background sound that mixed with the winter wind outside. A skilled craftswoman could complete a pair of snowshoes in a few days of steady work, but the knowledge required which woods worked best, how to prepare the rawhide, what weaving patterns provided the right balance of strength and flexibility represented generations of accumulated wisdom. Fire-making tools were perhaps the most critical technology any tribe possessed, since the ability to create warmth and cook food determined whether a family would survive until spring. The bow drill used by northeastern tribes was elegantly simple but required precise craftsmanship to work reliably. The fireboard had to be made from exactly the right wood, cedar or basswood, that was dry but not too dry, soft enough to create friction dust, but hard enough not to wear away too quickly. Making a proper fireboard was boring, methodical work that could take hours of careful carving and testing. The wood had to be shaped just so, with the notch cut at precisely the right angle and depth to allow the friction dust to accumulate without being blown away by the slightest breeze. The bow itself required its own specialized knowledge, selecting a curved piece of wood that had the right flexibility, stringing it with sinew that had been prepared to exactly the right thickness and tension. The drill had to be perfectly straight and the right diameter, carved smooth to reduce unnecessary friction, but with enough surface texture to create heat when spun rapidly. A fire-making kit wasn't just tools, it was a carefully balanced system where every component had been crafted to work perfectly with all the others. Experienced firemakers could have flames going in minutes, but achieving that level of skill required years of practice and an understanding of how different weather conditions affected each step of the process. Out on the Great Plains, where winter winds could drive snow for days without stopping, Plains tribes had developed the travois, a simple but brilliant transportation system that could move entire camps across frozen landscapes. Building a travois was straightforward work that nonetheless required careful attention to detail. The poles had to be selected from trees that were straight and strong, but not too heavy, then carefully shaped to the right diameter and length. The attachment points where the poles connected to dogs or horses required precise craftsmanship to loose, and the travois would fall apart under load, too tight and it would break when hitting obstacles. The platforms were woven from hide strips or constructed from wooden slats, creating surfaces that could carry hundreds of pounds of supplies while still being light enough for animals to pull across snow and rough terrain. The genius of the travois lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity, a design so basic that it could be repaired with materials found anywhere on the plains, yet so effective that it remained the primary transportation technology for nomadic tribes for centuries. Loading a travois was an art form in itself, with heavier items placed low and toward the front to prevent tipping, while lighter but more fragile items were packed carefully on top and secured with rawhide ropes. Women became expert at calculating exactly how much weight each travois could carry, and how to distribute loads to prevent damage to both the equipment and the precious supplies it carried. The sight of a winter camp breaking down and loading onto travois was remarkable. What had been a village of tipis would transform into a moving caravan in just a few hours of efficient, practiced work. In the Arctic, where survival often depended on the ability to hunt seals through holes in the ice, The Inuit had perfected the harpoon into a sophisticated hunting system that could function reliably in the most extreme conditions. Creating a harpoon wasn't just carving a sharp point and attaching it to a handle, it was crafting a precision instrument with multiple moving parts that had to work perfectly every time. The shaft was usually made from driftwood that had been aged and seasoned until it was both strong and flexible. The harpoon head was carved from walrus ivory or bone, shaped into a point sharp enough to penetrate seal hide, but designed to detach from the shaft on impact while remaining connected by a long line of braided sinew. The hunting strategy that surrounded harpoon use required patience that modern people would find almost unbearable. An Inuit hunter might stand motionless beside a seal's breathing hole for 8, 10, or even 12 hours, harpoon poised and ready, waiting for the moment when a seal surfaced to breathe. The slightest movement or sound could scare the seal away, meaning hours of waiting would be wasted. This wasn't exciting hunting, it was boring, methodical, and absolutely essential work that required the kind of mental discipline that could only be developed through years of practice. The hunter's clothing had to be designed to provide warmth without restricting movement, and the harpoon had to be balanced perfectly to allow for an accurate throw even when the hunter's muscles were stiff from cold and hours of motionless waiting. The ulu knife used by Inuit women was another example of tool design perfected through generations of use. The crescent-shaped blade and central handle weren't arbitrary choices, they represented the most efficient design for the endless cutting, scraping, and food preparation tasks that kept Arctic families alive. Making an ulu required finding exactly the right piece of slate or metal for the blade, shaping it to the perfect curve, and attaching it to a handle carved from bone or antler with joints tight enough to withstand constant use in freezing temperatures. Women would use their ulus for everything from skinning seals to cutting sinew for sewing, and a well-made ulu could last 4 years of daily use while remaining sharp enough to slice through frozen meat. The Kullik oil lamp represented perhaps the most sophisticated heating technology developed by any Arctic people. These weren't simple containers for burning oil, they were precisely engineered heating systems that could provide warmth and light for months while using minimal fuel. The lamp itself was carved from soapstone in a shallow, elongated bowl shape that allowed the maximum surface area of oil to burn while minimizing the risk of spilling. The wick was made from Arctic cotton or moss, carefully prepared and shaped to burn at exactly the right rate. Adjusting a kullik required constant attention. Too much wick and the lamp would smoke and waste oil, too little and it wouldn't provide enough heat. Women became expert at reading the flame, making tiny adjustments throughout the day to maintain perfect combustion that would keep their igloos warm without wasting precious seal oil that meant the difference between life and death. Tool maintenance was as important as tool creation, and winter months in shelters were filled with the quiet, methodical work of keeping equipment in perfect condition. Blades needed to be sharpened, handles needed to be rewrapped with fresh sinew, and every component needed to be checked for signs of wear that could lead to failure at a critical moment. This maintenance work created its own rhythm in winter camps, the soft sound of whetstones against metal, the gentle scraping of bone being shaped, the quiet conversation of people working together on tasks that required attention but left the mind free to wander. These tools weren't just objects, they were the physical embodiment of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, each design refined through countless generations of use until it achieved a kind of perfection that could only come from the absolute necessity of getting things right the first time. Every time, when failure meant not just inconvenience, but death in a world where the next opportunity to make or repair critical equipment might not come until spring. Chapter 5: Resource Management and Winter Navigation, the ability to read the land like a book and manage its resources with precision often determined which families would emerge from winter healthy and which would barely survive until spring. Native American tribes had developed resource management systems so sophisticated that they could sustain communities for thousands of years without depleting the environment turning the harsh winter landscape into a network of carefully maintained opportunities. In the Arctic, where a single mistake in navigation could mean wandering lost until death, the Inuit had perfected the art of reading snow itself as a navigation tool. Different types of snow formed predictable patterns based on wind direction, and an experienced traveler could orient themselves by feeling the texture of snowdrifts even in complete darkness or whiteout conditions. This knowledge wasn't learned from books, it was accumulated through years of patient observation, noting how different wind patterns created different snow formations, and remembering those patterns well enough to stake your life on them. The construction of an Inuksuk stone cairns that served as navigation markers was both practical engineering and artistic expression. These weren't random piles of rocks, but carefully balanced structures designed to be visible from great distances while using minimal materials. Building an Inuksuk required understanding how different stone shapes would interact, which combinations would remain stable through Arctic storms, and how to position them to catch light in ways that would make them visible even in the flat, gray light of winter. The process was methodical and almost meditative, selecting each stone carefully, testing different positions, adjusting the balance until the structure could stand through the worst weather the Arctic could deliver. A well-built Inuksuk could serve as a landmark for generations, guiding hunters and travelers across landscapes that otherwise offered no distinguishable features. Reading animal signs in snow required skills that went far beyond simple tracking. The Inuit could tell not just what animals had passed, but when they had passed, what they were doing, and where they were likely to go next. Caribou tracks in hard snow meant the animals were moving fast, probably migrating, while tracks in soft snow suggested they were feeding and might be found nearby. Seal tracks leading to breathing holes could indicate whether the hole was active or abandoned, information that could save a hunter hours of fruitless waiting. This knowledge was accumulated through thousands of hours of patient observation, noting the subtle differences between tracks made at different times and under different conditions, building a mental library of information that could be accessed instantly when survival depended on making the right choice. On the Great Plains, where winter camps had to be positioned to take advantage of shelter, water, and firewood while remaining accessible to hunting areas, the Lakota and Cheyenne had developed site selection processes that considered dozens of variables. A good winter camp location needed protection from the prevailing winds, access to water that wouldn't freeze completely, timber for fuel and construction, and proximity to areas where game might shelter during storms. But it also needed to be defensible, accessible to other tribal groups for trade and social contact, and positioned to take advantage of the sun's warming rays during the brief winter days. The process of selecting these sites began in late summer, with scouts ranging across the territory to evaluate potential locations, testing water sources, examining the growth patterns of grass that would indicate soil quality and drainage, and observing the behavior of animals that might serve as indicators of local conditions. The rotation of hunting areas was a critical resource management strategy that prevented overexploitation of game populations. Plains tribes wouldn't simply hunt wherever they found animals, they followed complex schedules that allowed different areas to recover between hunting seasons. This required keeping mental maps of vast territories, remembering which areas had been used heavily in previous years and which had been given time to recover. Hunters would sometimes travel many miles to reach areas that were designated for use in a particular season, passing through areas where game was present, but off limits according to the tribal conservation system. This wasn't just practical resource management, it was a sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that allowed sustainable hunting practices to continue for thousands of years. Water management in winter required understanding how different types of water sources behaved in freezing conditions. Springs that flowed from deep underground might remain unfrozen even in severe cold, while surface streams could freeze solid and become inaccessible for months. The Plains tribes memorized the locations of reliable water sources across enormous territories, noting which springs continued flowing in different types of winters, which streams had the deepest pools that might not freeze completely, and which snow deposits could be safely melted for drinking water without risking contamination. This knowledge was passed down through generations of winter travelers, each family contributing observations about water sources in their particular territory and receiving information about areas they might need to travel through during harsh winters. Firewood management was perhaps the most critical resource challenge faced by Plains tribes, since wood was scarce across much of their territory and had to be carefully conserved through the long winter months. Families would begin collecting and caching firewood in late summer, cutting dead trees and branches and storing them in hidden locations that could be accessed throughout the winter. The selection process was almost scientific. Different types of wood burned at different rates and produced different amounts of heat. So a proper firewood cache would include a mixture of quick burning kindling, medium burning wood for daily cooking, and long burning hardwood for overnight fires. The storage locations had to be positioned to remain accessible even in deep snow, but hidden enough to prevent theft by other groups that might be desperate for fuel. In the Northeast, where forests provided abundant resources but also presented navigation challenges during winter storms, the Iroquois and Algonquin had developed trail systems that remained functional even under deep snow. These weren't random paths through the woods, but carefully planned routes that took advantage of natural features to provide protection from wind and easy navigation in poor visibility. Trail markers were subtle, but unmistakable to those who knew how to read them. Particular arrangements of stones, bent branches that would remain recognizable even when covered with snow, or blazes cut into trees at heights that would remain visible above snow drifts. Maintaining these trail systems was community work that continued throughout the winter, with hunters and travelers responsible for clearing fallen trees, refreshing markers that had been damaged by storms, and reporting any changes in conditions that might affect the safety or usability of different routes. The management of food caches required both practical knowledge and social organization to prevent conflicts over resources that could mean survival for multiple families. Cache locations were often kept secret, known only to the family that created them and trusted allies who might need to access them in emergencies. But the social rules governing cache use were complex and carefully maintained. Under what circumstances could one family access another's cache? How much could be taken? And what obligations were created by using someone else's resources? These weren't written laws, but understood social contracts that had been refined through generations of winter survival, creating systems that balanced individual family security with community survival needs. Food rationing systems were sophisticated mathematical calculations disguised as simple household management. Women would calculate not just how much food their families needed to survive until spring, but how much extra they could afford to share with relatives or trade for other necessities, how much should be held in reserve for unexpected emergencies, and how consumption rates might need to be adjusted if winter proved longer or harder than expected. This required understanding the nutritional needs of different family members, the caloric content of different foods, and the seasonal variations that might affect when fresh food would again become available. Mistakes in these calculations could be fatal, but the knowledge required to make them accurately was passed down through generations of women who had successfully managed their families through countless winters, creating informal but highly effective systems for ensuring that carefully preserved resources would last exactly as long as they needed to. The spring transition required its own set of resource management skills, as families had to balance using up remaining winter stores against the uncertainty of when new resources would become available. Starting the transition too early could mean running out of preserved food before fresh food became available, while waiting too long could mean missing the narrow window when certain spring foods were at their nutritional peak. This timing required reading dozens of environmental signs, the behavior of migratory birds, the rate of snow melt, the appearance of the first green shoots, and the subtle changes in daylight that indicated the seasons were truly changing. These observations had to be combined with knowledge of local variations. Some areas would green up weeks before others. Some food sources would become available early, while others remained inaccessible until late spring, creating a complex calculation that determined when families could safely begin the gradual transition from winter survival mode to spring abundance, marking the successful completion of another winter survival cycle that had required every ounce of knowledge, skill, and careful planning that had been developed and refined through countless generations of people who understood that survival wasn't about dramatic heroics, but about the patient, methodical application of accumulated wisdom to the endless challenge of living in harmony with a landscape that offered abundance to those who knew how to find it. As spring finally whispered its way back across the frozen landscape, these communities had done something remarkable. They had turned winter from an enemy into a teacher. The snow that had threatened to bury them became insulation for their shelters. The cold that could have killed them became a preservative for their food. The isolation that might have driven them to despair became an opportunity to strengthen family bonds and pass down knowledge that would keep future generations alive. They didn't conquer winter. They learned to dance with it, finding rhythm in the patient work of survival and beauty in the simple act of staying warm together. Today, when our heating fails for an hour, we call it an emergency. When the power goes out, we feel disconnected from the world. But there's something deeply comforting about remembering a time when people found security not in technology, but in knowledge, when families could look at approaching storm clouds and feel confident rather than afraid, because they knew exactly what to do. These weren't superhuman people. They were humans who had simply learned to pay attention, to prepare carefully, and to find abundance in what others might see as scarcity. Their winter survival wasn't about dramatic moments of heroism, but about the quiet competence that comes from truly understanding your place in the world. Perhaps the most beautiful part of their story is how it demonstrates that survival and community aren't opposite forces, they're the same thing. Every hide scraped by patient hands, every cache of food carefully stored, every child taught to read weather signs was an investment in the whole community's future. They understood something we're still learning, that taking care of each other and taking care of ourselves are really the same activity played out in the slow rhythm of seasons that demand both individual skill and collective wisdom. Sleep well tonight, knowing that for thousands of years, families just like yours found ways to stay warm, stay fed, and stay together through the darkest months. Their patience lives on in these quiet moments between day and night, when the only urgency is the gentle need to rest. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be as peaceful as a snow-covered tipi where the fire burns steady and the children sleep warm. What other eras of patient survival would you like to explore together? The slow rhythm of medieval monastery life, the methodical work of lighthouse keepers through stormy seasons. Leave a comment and let me know what forgotten moments of American history help you find rest. If stories like these bring you peace, subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are so many more quiet corners of the past waiting to be shared with our sleepless community. If you're still awake after hearing about all that patient winter preparation, tell me in the comments what decade or type of survival story you'd like to drift off to next time. Until then, rest easy in the knowledge that humans have always found ways to endure, to care for each other, and to find comfort in the simple repetition of necessary tasks that keep life going, one quiet day at a time.